Hello and welcome to this video in which we are going to analyze some of the movements of the guitar technique of Ida Presti. Ida Presti is no doubt an enigmatic character. To me, I kind of liken her to the Randy Rhoads of the classical guitar world. Someone absolutely unique, who accomplished many great things in their career, but who died tragically young and kind of left us to wonder what else they would have accomplished. In the research I do for these videos, I don't do a lot of focus on biographical information. That's not really my forte, but in just finding recordings and looking at videos of Ida Presti, I came across quotes by many people saying they believed she was the greatest classical guitarist to ever live. And I had certainly never heard of her talked about that way. In fact, I went through a whole guitar degree without ever knowing who she was, not knowing that she existed. In listening to her playing and studying her technique, which there are more recordings available than I at first thought. There's a decent amount of recordings that she made, both solo and with her second husband, Ida Lagoya, of course, in their duo. But in studying her, I can see some reasons why someone might think she was the greatest to ever live when it comes to classical guitar playing. So a while back, I had a colleague reach out to me from the UK, and he said, you should do one of these analysis videos on Ida Presti because she has some interesting things going on with her technique. So right then, I just went to YouTube, found a video of her, and right away I thought, okay, she is an absolute freak of nature. And those are the kind of people that I really admire and that I want to study, because I love to point out how different things work for different people. In looking at some of these physical things that she would do, she is very unique. And we're going to jump right into her general right hand plucking position. That's kind of where I like to start usually. And what jumped out at me right away, probably the first thing I noticed is the extreme angle of her wrist. In these clips here, you can see a very tall wrist and an extreme angle. And as her plucking hand hangs down, it's like pointing straight towards the ground, giving this really extreme bend to the wrist. Almost looks like from some angles, it's going back a bit, like towards her right. And this, to me, looks totally like an anatomy thing. I've heard people talk about, here's how you play like her and things like that. And I would just say a word of caution if you're going to try things out like this, because some people's wrists will work this way, like hers, but other people's will not. Here, I wanted to kind of show the contrast. So this is a clip where she gets into position to do some pizzicato. And what you can see is the difference in her general hand position and then what might be considered kind of a more modern hand position with a very straight wrist. It's a little bit extreme because it's pizzicato, but you can see her wrist straighten out, and then you can see her turn towards the pinky side of her hand. She's coming from a completely different position, very tall wrist, everything hanging above the strings and leaning more towards the thumb side, as opposed to the straighter wrist and leaning more towards the other side of the hand. Here, I want to take a brief look into what her hand position kind of looks like when she changes into something like a rest stroke position. So here you can see her executing a passage exclusively with rest strokes. At least that's my guess. I can't tell for sure. We'll talk more about that in a second. But as she gets into her rest stroke position, she leans more towards the thumb side. You can see her wrist, it kind of flattens out, but the opposite way that we kind of saw before. It doesn't flatten out because it comes down towards the pinky side. It flattens out because it moves more kind of towards the thumb side and it dips in. Now her thumb is just kind of hanging down, maybe touching a string, but not doing a whole lot. And then she executes these rest strokes. When she does rest stroke, she maintains a very fierce angle with her middle joints. you can see here that her middle joints stay bent, and it's darn near a 90-degree angle. And this is very unusual. Most players, I would say, they have a pretty definite hand position change when they get into rest stroke. And she doesn't. And here's where I kind of want to segue into the next aspect to talk about. I wanted to see what is her rest stroke hand position and how does it differ. And I had trouble finding an instance, and I realized, well, there's a lot of times I can't tell if she's playing rest or free stroke. She can do either one from basically the same hand position. Now, there are some instances where you can pretty much see a change, kind of like the one that we just saw. And then probably, I would guess that there are still minute changes happening. But in these shots here, I thought it was a good mix of seeing some rest strokes and then seeing some free strokes. The movement of her fingers, if she's doing either rest or free stroke, is extremely identical. You can see with the rest strokes that it's this kind of needle type approach. That's the way I describe it, because many people will lean back when they do rest stroke, myself included. This is how I typically feel it. And you have more fingertip on the string. It's just a different approach. But her fingers are still very in front of the string, just like she does a free stroke. It's just instead of bringing the fingertip up at the end of the stroke, it's just going straight down and into the guitar. The only way I can tell which is which is because with the free strokes, you can see her fingers land in the air. I mean, you can see the movement of the fingertips going up. Otherwise, if it's a shot like from the front, for instance, that we get sometimes, this back of the wrist shot, I mean, here, is she doing rest stroke or is she doing free stroke? I couldn't tell you. I have no idea. It could be either one, because apparently she was able to do either one from essentially the same hand position. And one more thing about the plucking hand before we move on to the fretboard hand. With the things that we just discussed in mind, in this clip here, we can see her executing a rather straightforward, or so you might think, P-I-M-A-M-I arpeggio. So this is a common arpeggio. It's great for study. You'll find it in many instances in both classical and flamenco music. Now, if you want to be a, quote, good teacher, okay, get out your notepad. Be sure you have your good teacher phrases to say, okay? So a good teacher phrase is, oh, don't move your hand when you do that, okay? So let's pretend you have a student come in, they're doing this arpeggio, and oh, they're moving their hand all around. Well, be sure when you do this passage, keep your hand still. Don't move it back and forth, right? But then we have this here. So what is going on? This is a simple arpeggio, right? I'm not sure off the top of my head, but I'm guessing that she's playing accompaniment right now to a lead part. So why is there so much movement in her hand? You can see as she starts the arpeggio, it looks like she's coming from kind of like her general free stroke position. As she goes up and then starts coming back down the strings, you see a definite change. Her wrist and her whole arm really moves towards her left side. And it looks kind of like something like her rest stroke hand position. Now with this angle, and based on what we've already seen her do, are these free strokes or are they rest strokes? Well, there's no telling. It could be either one. And because we can't see where the fingertip ends up, who knows? My guess is perhaps she's doing something like doing free stroke up the strings, and then on the way back, perhaps some of those are rest strokes. Or at least she's utilizing that kind of angle. But I think instances like this are so interesting. This is such a basic thing, and she needs to basically have two hand positions for this one arpeggio pattern. So just very fascinating to me what she utilizes here for this very simple and straightforward pattern. Next, I want to look at something with her fretboard hand. Now, we've looked at a few players in this series who exemplify this concept, and Ida Presti, she could lead the charge on this team for sure. So she is one of these people that, not all the time, but certainly periodically, she will stick out the fourth finger on her fretboard hand, which I call flag polling. So she's a flag poller. And in these clips, you can see time after time instances where this fourth finger shoots out and is fully extended. Of course, many of these great players start out very young. They have a great mixture of starting young and being brilliant and having good teaching. And you just wonder, is this just something that they didn't want to do? Is this something where they were told, you should do it this other way, and they just said no? Is it something where they said, well, I'm not going to do it the other way because this way works way better, and then, they go on to have their career, doing it that way? Who knows? All I know is that there are many people in this club, Julian Bream, Sabikis, Kyuhee Park, to say a few, and that is fantastic company, no doubt. But when I was studying this instance, I really became fascinated at the fact that, there is a moment in which the pinky is ready to strike. It just happens to be 3 or 4 inches away from the guitar and fully extended. In my own work, I feel like when a technique is working well, there is kind of a moment of foresight, basically before every move. I feel like there's definitely a moment of, relaxation, getting ready, where the fingers are going to come from somewhere. My teacher used to say, if you don't know what your hands are doing before you move them, then you don't have any technique. So something along those lines. So again, if you're taking good teacher notes, here's a good one. Be sure that your fourth finger is nice and curled, just like the other fingers. Be sure it's always right above the string. And so it just has to come down, nice and neat, well behaved, just like all the other fingers. But what's fascinating to me about this is that the so-called moment of foresight for her fourth finger in these instances is fully extended and several inches away from the guitar. That is the moment where she's about to pounce on the next note. And when she uses it this way, she comes in perfectly. As accurate as can be, it is a worked in part of her technique. Of course, she will also use a curled pinky at times, so when is the moment where it flattens and extends, and then when is the instance where it's going to be curled and, more well behaved? I'm not sure. But the moments where she sticks it out and slams it down, she's absolutely as accurate as can be. And one more thing about this fourth finger, I know that I've heard people talk about the fourth finger on the plucking hand being used for balance when you extend it. And I think sometimes we see people do that same thing with the fretboard hand. So here's an instance where she is doing some vibrato, and she is actually sticking her pinky straight out. It looks like it is part of this technique to shake the note. So it is extended, and you can see a big gap between her third and fourth fingers. And she does the vibrato on a couple of different notes, and each time you can see her stick the fourth finger out, and it looks like it is definitely somehow involved in the movement of her fretboard hand to execute this vibrato. So even if she is not about to use the pinky, there are times where she extends it and still finds a way to work it into her fretboard hand technique. So next I want to talk about some flair. Okay, so I'm always kind of on the lookout for how people move when they play. What are some things that are part of their processes? Is it facial expressions? Is it a posture? What other movements are going on? And I noticed with Ida Presti that she definitely plays with a high amount of flair with both hands, When it comes to body movement and facial expressions, I notice next to none. A tiny kind of normal amount of body movement, but really not a facial expression type of person. However, I noticed some consistent movements with both of her hands that I would just call flair. So first, let's look at the plucking hand. She will throw her arm out with big chords. And this is a consistent part of her technique. Some players, they will end a section or end a piece, and they will pluck the chord and then kind of throw their arm out as a way to say, yeah, it's over, or what have you. But it happens so swift in her technique, it looks to me like it is actually part of the chord. So if there's a big chord at the end of a phrase, she will throw the arm with the chord, and you can see her wrist pop up. And she does this over and over again when she plays. In this instance here, this is her and Lagoya playing the famous Defia piece, La Vida Breve. I've played this piece. It's a fantastic piece for guitar duo. And she's playing this passage where she's playing a big chord and then has to get back to do a few notes. Rest stroke, it looks like. My best guess. It kind of looks like her rest stroke hand position. And you can see she doesn't sacrifice the move of the big chord. Even though she has to move very fast to get back to doing a few notes rest stroke. So you might think you'd make the decision of like, well, I'm not going to do the big move for the chord here because then I've got to change hand position. But her approach is something like, well, I'm just going to move like a cheetah because I got to do that move for the big chord and I'm not going to take that out. So I'm just going to move super fast to get back to the other hand position. So she does this move a lot with her plucking hand. In this clip here, this is the two of them playing Beethoven, I believe. And she's playing some slower moving chords. And you can still see the consistent arm and wrist movement with each chord, which is very interesting to me. And then at the end of the phrase, then you see kind of a big lift. So that tells me this was just part of her technique. It was part of her chord playing. It was part of her right hand approach to do these types of moves. Even if it's slower moving, it still has that energy, it still has that flair. And it was just part of the way that she played. Now, in case you're wondering, well, what about the fretboard hand? Is there any flair going on there? Well, let's see if we can find some. So I first noticed something in this clip here, where she's playing this passage and I saw her do this big move with her fretboard hand and I didn't hear any sound. It's like she's playing these chords kind of in a mid position and then there's this very swift move up the fingerboard and it's not like she's jumping to a high harmonic or any notes up there or anything like that. All she does is do this little whoop and then returns back to where she was because she has to play that same chord again. So she's going through this series of movements to go away from the position that she just left that she's going to go right back to. Why would you do that? Well, for flair is all that I can think of. And I would just guess it gave some kind of feeling that she was after when she played the guitar. This shot here, this is back to the Defia, I think captures it really well because it's like you can tell they're trying to focus on the plucking hand. So you don't really see any fretboard hand. But then all of a sudden, it's this blink and you'll miss it moment where she throws her fretboard hand out there. She's doing the flair thing and you just see it for a split second. So I've slowed it down here so you can see it. And then if we pause on it, you can see her, quote, position here. It looks nothing like it does when she plays. The fingers are extended, they're flat, there's all these space between the fingers. What's going on here? She's not about to play anything in this very brief, very short moment. She's just throwing her hand out there. These movements of flair, they're definitely rhythmic, they're with the music, and they are no doubt part of her technique. And I can just only imagine that these elements of flair just put her in the mood to play the way that she needed to play. So those are the main points that we're going to go over here, but I have one more little bonus thing for you. Especially if you are a teacher like me, you may find this kind of humorous, because I do. So if you teach, then you probably run into this type of instance where you have a student come in. It could be a young person or it could be an adult, and they get out their guitar and they don't tune. So you remind them like, oh, go ahead and tune before you do that. And then they respond with something like, oh, well, I tuned it last week. Right. And that, is their kind of approach to tuning. One of the things to me that you find that great players have in common, no matter what instrument they play, is that they are fantastically in tune. The higher the level, the more in tune these people are. So what Ida Presti shows here is there is never a bad moment to be out of tune. There's never a moment to say like, well, is this the right moment to tune or is it not? Because here she's performing. She's also performing on television. So for many people, this would be a really big deal. And there's just this moment here where she hears something and just says, well, I'm just going to make this little tweak in this split second I have between chords and just fix it. But I think this is a really neat example of a great musician in the middle of a big time performance saying there's never a bad moment to tune. And if you can be as slick as she is, just lightning fast, little tweak, and then, on to the next thing, I think that's pretty cool. So that is all that we're going to talk about here. I have probably any links that you might need listed in the description. I have the links to all the videos that I used footage from for this video, where you can go and listen to the performances and make your own observations. I also have a playlist of these technique analysis videos if you want to look at some other people that we've covered in the past. You will find a link to that playlist also in the description. Thank you very much for watching, and have a wonderful day.